As the King and Queen leave the thrones and head for the exit of Westminster Abbey of the coronation ceremony, you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the King, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes.
The decision lasted only seconds, but its meaning struck the royal family like a thunderclap. Lady Louise Windsor stood before Catherine and placed the Queen's diamond brooch into her hands, transforming a private inheritance into an unmistakable statement of trust. But the real shock came moments later. Queen Camilla had already appealed for the transfer to be reconsidered, and Louise refused. No delay, no compromise. And suddenly, one small jewel seemed powerful enough to divide an entire palace. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Louise had not treated the brooch as an ordinary royal ornament. It was a deeply personal piece, tied to Queen Elizabeth II, and had come into her care through a private family arrangement involving possessions associated with the late monarch. A private family arrangement means an understanding handled within the royal family, rather than through an official crown process. And that distinction gave Louise unusual emotional authority over what happened next. She was not simply moving jewelry. In her mind, she was deciding where a piece of Elizabeth's memory should live. Catherine understood that immediately. When Louise offered the brooch directly to the Princess of Wales, she did not reach for it at once. She asked twice whether the younger royal was completely certain. Only then did Catherine accept it, closing her fingers around the piece and admitting that it felt less like receiving jewelry and more like being trusted with memory. Louise watched her carefully, then answered with the sentence that changed the entire emotional weight of the moment. She would want it worn, not argued over. Catherine looked down and could not answer straight away. Camilla received the news very differently. In a private sitting room, an aide confirmed that Louise had rejected her earlier request to reconsider the handover. The Queen Consort had appealed before the transfer took place, not afterward, which meant Louise had understood exactly what she was doing when she proceeded. Camilla's expression hardened as she was told the matter was considered settled. For the Queen, the sting was not only about the brooch, it was the realization that her position had not been enough to change Louise's mind. Louise made the symbolism even stronger by refusing to send the jewel through staff. She had insisted on placing it into Catherine's hands herself, removing any possibility that the transfer could later be described as a misunderstanding or administrative error. The choice was personal, deliberate, final. That left the palace with two urgent questions. Why had Louise become so determined to place Elizabeth's brooch with Catherine, and why had Camilla cared enough to try to stop it before the handover happened? Because behind Louise's quiet refusal was not a sudden act of rebellion, but a deeply personal loyalty that had been forming for years, and Catherine was only one part of it. To understand why the brooch became so explosive, you have to understand the three women standing on opposite sides of it. Lady Louise was not chasing royal influence. Catherine had not demanded the jewel, and Camilla's objection was about far more than diamonds. Each woman saw the same heirloom differently. One saw a grandmother, another saw duty, and the third saw the dangerous possibility that royal memory was quietly moving toward the next generation without her. Louise had known Queen Elizabeth II in a way most of the public never could. To millions, she had been sovereign, meaning the reigning monarch and symbolic head of the crown. To her granddaughter, she was also Granny, a woman whose approval often came through quiet conversations, shared routines, and small signs of trust rather than dramatic praise. Louise had grown up outside the most intense royal spotlight, and that distance made the bond feel unusually personal. She did not see the brooch as a status object. She saw a piece of family memory she felt responsible for protecting. Catherine carried a different burden. As the woman expected one day to become queen beside William, every object connected with Elizabeth could be read as a symbol of continuity between generations. She did not need the brooch to prove her place. That was precisely why receiving it mattered. Catherine understood that an heirloom associated with the late monarch could quickly become more than jewelry once it entered public memory. It could become a statement about trust, succession, and whose hands were carrying the family story forward. Camilla understood that symbolism too, and it unsettled her. As queen, she believed being bypassed in such a sensitive transfer created an uncomfortable message about where affection and confidence were flowing inside the family. She could accept that Louise loved Catherine. What she found harder to accept was the possibility that the decision might be interpreted as another quiet shift of emotional authority toward the next generation. To Camilla, the brooch was not only personal, it was politically dangerous inside a family already sensitive to symbols. Catherine learned about the objection only after Louise arrived for the private handover. Her first instinct was to stop everything. She told the younger royal she would not accept a gift that could create another family wound. Louise refused immediately. She argued that surrendering the decision simply because someone objected would transform a loving choice into a competition over rank. Catherine finally asked the question neither woman had wanted to say aloud. "Is this about me?" Louise paused before answering. "No. It's about what Granny trusted us to understand." That distinction changed everything. The brooch was no longer about defeating Camilla or elevating Catherine. It was about Louise's belief that Elizabeth had taught them to separate duty from possession, memory from status, and love from hierarchy. But Louise had not reached that conclusion overnight. Months earlier, one uncomfortable royal gathering had shown her exactly what could happen when those lines became blurred, and one conversation that day convinced her the brooch could not remain where it was forever. The conflict did not begin on the day Catherine received the brooch. Its real beginning came months earlier, during what should have been an uneventful family gathering at Windsor. There, one conversation about the late Queen's jewelry stopped Lady Louise cold. Nobody shouted. Nobody issued an order. But by the time she left that room, Louise had reached a private conclusion. One particular diamond brooch would never be allowed to become a symbol of seniority, competition, or possession. Louise had kept the brooch stored privately because deciding its future felt too personal, while the family was still adjusting to life without Queen Elizabeth II. The new reign had changed titles, duties, and expectations almost overnight, but grief did not move that quickly. Catherine had already worn several pieces associated with the late monarch, yet she had never asked Louise about this one. That restraint mattered. To Louise, it suggested the princess understood that inheritance could carry emotional meaning beyond ownership. The turning point came during a private Windsor family reception after a Commonwealth service. The Commonwealth service is a formal royal event, celebrating the association of nations, linked through the Commonwealth, and conversations afterward often drift toward future ceremonies and family responsibilities. During one such discussion, Camilla spoke about historically important jewels returning to public use, and remarked that significant pieces should, whenever possible, remain aligned with the reigning queen's household. Louise barely responded, but the phrase stayed with her. The reigning queen's household sounded orderly, even reasonable, yet something about it unsettled her deeply. The brooch had belonged to her grandmother in a personal way. Louise did not believe its future should automatically follow rank simply because the crown had passed to another generation. Camilla may have been speaking about continuity, but to the younger royal, it sounded dangerously close to entitlement. Catherine noticed the change in Louise before anyone challenged the remark. She could have defended her own position or entered the discussion about future use, but instead she quietly changed the subject. That restraint became unforgettable. Louise saw that Catherine was not trying to win anything, and the contrast between claiming a place and refusing to compete hardened something inside her. Louise returned to the brooch that same evening. For the first time in months, she opened its storage case and held the decision in front of her. She no longer wanted the piece hidden indefinitely, but she also refused to let institutional precedents decide its destination. Catherine, she realized, understood the difference between carrying Elizabeth's legacy and claiming ownership over it. Louise placed the brooch back inside the case and closed the lid. Then she opened it again. That hesitation became the moment she finally knew. Catherine would receive it one day, not because she outranked anyone, but because Louise trusted her not to treat memory like a prize. But private decisions become dangerous once other people discover them, and when Camilla learned what Louise intended, restraint gave way to confrontation. Camilla did not send another aide. She did not hide behind protocol. Once she understood that Louise intended to give Catherine the brooch, the Queen requested a private conversation and made the appeal herself. What followed was not a screaming match. It was far more uncomfortable than that. Two women sat opposite each other, speaking carefully, because both understood exactly what was at stake. Camilla wanted reconsideration. Louise wanted her choice respected. Neither woman was willing to pretend the disagreement meant nothing. Camilla entered believing the situation could still be contained quietly. She was not trying to seize the brooch or issue a formal command. Her argument was that moving such a personal piece directly toward the future queen could create symbolism the family did not need. Royal protocol means the customs and expectations that guide how the monarchy handles duties, precedents, and sensitive family matters. But the Queen was deliberately trying to keep this outside that machinery. Louise knew that too. She had arrived prepared, because refusing Camilla face-to-face would carry far more emotional weight than simply rejecting a message delivered through staff. Camilla chose her words carefully. "I'm asking you to reconsider, not ordering you." Louise acknowledged the distinction immediately, but her answer did not soften. She said Queen Elizabeth II had taught her that personal gifts did not become institutional property simply because circumstances changed. To Louise, the brooch belonged to memory before it belonged to rank. The Queen listened, but tension entered the conversation the moment Catherine's name surfaced. Camilla asked whether Catherine had encouraged the transfer. Louise answered without hesitation. No. The princess knew nothing about the decision and had never asked for the brooch. Louise defended her firmly because she refused to let Catherine be turned into the hidden force behind a choice she had not even known existed. Camilla's composure slipped slightly. If Catherine had not pushed for the jewel, then the argument could not be dismissed as ambition from the next generation. Louise then revealed what made the room colder. She had made her decision after the Windsor reception, during the same conversation in which Camilla had argued that important jewels should remain aligned with the reigning queen. The younger royal had heard continuity. She had also heard ownership. Camilla suddenly understood that her own words had helped create the outcome she was now trying to reverse. Camilla placed one hand flat on the table. "So there is nothing I can say." Louise looked directly at her. "Not about this." The Queen slowly withdrew her hand. The confrontation was over, but the larger battle had only begun. Louise had defended her choice emotionally. Now the palace had to determine whether she truly possessed the authority to make it, and that question would move the dispute away from memory and into power, because even a grandmother's brooch becomes dangerous when private inheritance collides with the machinery of monarchy. After the confrontation, attention shifted to the one person capable of changing the atmosphere with a single sentence: King Charles. Camilla expected her husband to understand why the transfer troubled her. Louise knew her uncle could make the disagreement unbearably difficult. Catherine wanted no part of a family battle. Yet when the question finally reached Charles, the king discovered something uncomfortable. This was one royal dispute, where exercising power could cost him far more than simply allowing the decision to stand. Charles received a private briefing, explaining exactly where the brooch stood. The distinction mattered. Crown jewels are objects held for the monarchy as an institution, while personal possessions can pass through the family according to private wishes and arrangements. In this case, advisors told the king that the brooch was being treated as a personal family object under Louise's control. That meant intervention was possible only at a heavy emotional price. If Charles stepped in, a granddaughter's decision about her grandmother's memory would suddenly become a command from the sovereign. Charles felt the conflict immediately. Camilla was his wife, and he understood why being bypassed had wounded her. Yet Louise was also acting from loyalty to Queen Elizabeth II, and the monarch remembered how fiercely his mother protected the difference between public duty and private family bonds. Supporting Camilla too aggressively could make Louise feel that rank had defeated exactly the kind of personal choice Elizabeth once valued. Catherine made her own position clear to William. She told the prince that if Charles asked, she would return the brooch without argument. The future king pushed back. He understood her instinct to prevent further damage, but he warned that surrendering the jewel now could humiliate Louise. It would suggest that her decision had mattered only until someone more senior disliked it. Catherine knew he had a point, and that realization made accepting the brooch feel even heavier. Charles then received the detail that settled the matter. Louise had left a short written confirmation stating that the transfer was voluntary, personal, and final. She had not written it to challenge the king. She had written it to protect Catherine from any later suggestion that the princess had requested, pressured, or maneuvered for the peace. Charles read the statement twice. He removed his glasses and sat in silence before looking toward the aide beside him. Then it remains her decision. The words carried more sadness than authority. By refusing to overrule Louise, the king effectively ended Camilla's institutional path to stopping the gift. Camilla had not been stripped of a title, possession, or formal right. That was precisely why the moment cut so deeply. She had simply reached a limit she had not expected to confront. And once that limit became undeniable, the argument stopped being about who could control the brooch and became about how the queen would live with being told no. The most painful moment does not happen during the confrontation. It comes afterward, when there is nobody left to persuade. Camilla returns to her private rooms knowing Louise will not reverse the gift, Catherine will not be asked to surrender it, and Charles will not intervene. For the first time, the rejection becomes personal. The queen has not lost a jewel she owned. She has lost the ability to shape what that jewel will now represent. Camilla feels the silence settle around the decision almost immediately. Staff are quietly told to treat Catherine's possession of the brooch as settled, with no further internal discussion unless the family itself raises the matter again. A household instruction is simply a private direction to royal staff about how an issue should be handled, and in this case the message is unmistakable. There will be no second appeal. Catherine, meanwhile, chooses not to wear the jewel. She keeps it privately, partly out of respect for Louise, and partly because appearing in it too soon could look like triumph over the queen. Camilla finds that absence of conflict harder than the conflict itself. There is no argument left to win, no procedure to challenge, and no compromise that allows everyone to leave satisfied. Charles visits her privately, and she finally explains what has been troubling her beneath the surface. She says she never wanted to take anything from Louise. She wanted to stop the family from creating another symbol that outsiders could use to compare queens. The king listens, then answers with uncomfortable calm. Trying to control the symbol has only made it more powerful. Camilla admits what she has been reluctant to say aloud. Every time Catherine receives something closely linked to Queen Elizabeth II, she feels public imagination rushing toward the future reign before the present one has fully settled. The transfers themselves may be personal, but the meaning attached to them rarely stays private. Charles understands the fear, yet he refuses to pretend the comparison can be eliminated. The line of succession, the fixed order determining who inherits the throne, means Catherine will always be measured against those who came before her. Fighting every reminder, he says, only makes the future look like a threat. Camilla says nothing for several seconds after he leaves. She removes another brooch from her own jacket, places it on the table, and stares at it before asking an aide to cancel the rest of her private appointments. The gesture says more than anger could have. She is not mourning ownership, she is mourning control over the story. But Catherine is struggling too. She never wanted to become the symbol at the center of Camilla's insecurity. And Louise begins to realize the gift has placed a burden on the woman she meant to honor. That is why one final conversation becomes necessary without aides, without palace language, and without Camilla in the room. By the time Catherine asks Louise to meet privately, the brooch feels heavier than diamonds ever should. She worries that accepting it has wounded Camilla, divided the family, and turned Louise into an unwilling combatant. But Louise has something Catherine still does not understand. This was never a coronation by jewelry. It was never an attempt to humiliate the queen. Behind a closed door, with no aides and no official record, Louise finally explains exactly why she chose Catherine. Catherine begins the conversation by making one offer she has already made before. If keeping the brooch threatens family relationships, she will return it. A private family meeting means a conversation held outside official royal business, without staff shaping the wording or creating a formal record, and that privacy allows both women to speak more freely. Louise immediately rejects the idea that Catherine caused any of this. She reminds her that the decision had been made before the princess even knew she was being considered. Catherine then admits something more personal. Receiving objects connected to Queen Elizabeth II does not always feel flattering. Sometimes it frightens her. Each heirloom becomes another reminder of the role waiting ahead, another silent comparison, another expectation she may never fully satisfy. Louise listens because she understands that what looks like privilege from the outside can feel like pressure from within. The younger royal had never intended the brooch to become another burden. Louise confesses that Camilla's hurt troubles her too. She never wanted to embarrass the queen or create the impression that one woman had been chosen over another. She regrets that a private decision became emotionally charged. But regret is not the same as reversal. Louise still believes changing course now would betray the reason she made the choice in the first place. Louise finally explains what Catherine had never known. She remembers watching her speak with Elizabeth during family gatherings without performing for her, flattering her, or treating her first as monarch. Catherine had spoken naturally, with respect but without fear. The late queen, Louise says, noticed that quality. On one private occasion, Elizabeth described Catherine's strength not as glamour, rank, or perfect composure, but as the ability to remain steady when everyone around her became unsettled. Louise had carried that memory for years. Louise reaches across the table and closes Catherine's fingers around the brooch case. Don't wear it because you're next. Wear it because you remember her. Catherine's eyes fill, and for the first time she stops offering to return it. She finally understands that the gift is not a prediction of power. It is an act of memory. But private meaning rarely stays private inside the monarchy. And when Catherine finally steps out wearing Elizabeth's diamonds, one photograph will transform a family conversation into a national judgment. The palace can keep conversations private. It cannot keep diamonds invisible forever. When Catherine finally appears wearing the Queen's brooch at a major royal engagement, photographers capture the piece immediately. Within minutes, the image is everywhere. Yet the picture that grips the public is not merely Catherine wearing Elizabeth's jewel. It is another frame taken moments later, Catherine touching the brooch while speaking quietly to Lady Louise. Suddenly, millions of people understand that this is not simply jewelry. It is a message. Catherine had waited before wearing it, and that choice mattered. She selected a formal engagement centered on continuity and public service, rather than personal celebration, making clear that the brooch was being carried as part of royal duty, not displayed like a trophy. Louise was there too, which immediately weakened any suggestion that the princess had taken the jewel and distanced herself from the woman who gave it. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's principal administrative residence in London, and a central base for royal communications, issued only a restrained confirmation that the brooch had been a private gift from Louise to Catherine. Nothing more was said about Camilla's objection. Camilla watched the coverage from another royal residence and understood the symbolism instantly. The Queen had feared exactly this. Elizabeth's jewel was now becoming part of the public story of succession. Catherine had not created that interpretation, but she could not prevent it either. The image seemed to say that memory was moving forward naturally, and Camilla knew millions would read meaning into that movement. Louise felt the pressure differently. When cameras focused repeatedly on the brooch, she became visibly uneasy. Catherine noticed and moved toward her afterward, starting an ordinary conversation rather than allowing Louise to stand alone as though she had just made some political declaration. That small act protected the younger royal from being turned into a symbol against Camilla, and Louise understood exactly what Catherine was doing. The story shifted again when one broadcaster framed the moment not as Catherine defeats Camilla, but as Elizabeth's memory passes quietly to a new generation. That language changed the entire emotional direction. By morning, a London newspaper carried a full-page photograph of Catherine touching the diamonds beside Louise, beneath the headline, "The Queen's Diamonds, a Granddaughter's Choice." Later that day, a small crowd outside Windsor applauded as Louise's car passed through the gates. Louise saw the newspaper before breakfast and looked horrified by the size of the headline. Her mother reassured her that she had made a family decision, not a public declaration. That distinction mattered, even if the world had blurred it. Now only one question remained. With the public reading the moment as legacy, rather than rivalry, Catherine, Louise, Camilla, and Charles had to decide whether the brooch would permanently divide them or teach them what succession truly demanded. The answer would not come from another appeal, headline, or royal command. It would come from what each of them chose to do once there was nothing left to fight over. In the end, nobody lost a crown. Nobody surrendered a title. Yet one diamond brooch exposed something far more difficult inside the monarchy. The painful moment when memory begins moving from one generation to another. Louise had defended a grandmother. Catherine had accepted a responsibility she never requested. Camilla had confronted the fear of being bypassed, and Charles had discovered that sometimes preserving the family means refusing to exercise the power of a king. Now came the final reckoning. Time softened the sharpest edges of the dispute, but it did not erase what had happened. Catherine continued wearing the brooch selectively, choosing moments that carried meaning rather than turning it into a constant symbol. That restraint mattered because Louise had never wanted the jewel to become a trophy. Charles, meanwhile, rejected suggestions that the palace create new rules governing similar personal heirlooms. Palace protocol means the customs used to manage official royal conduct, and the king concluded that forcing every private family possession into those rules would destroy the very relationships the objects were meant to preserve. Camilla eventually asked Louise for another private conversation. This time there was no appeal, no request for reconsideration. The Queen admitted that her first reaction had come partly from fear. Every time an object connected with Queen Elizabeth II moved toward Catherine, she worried the public would interpret it as a judgment on her own place. Louise listened without hostility. She told Camilla that she had never rejected her as queen. She had simply refused to reorganize love for her grandmother according to rank. The distinction still hurt, but Camilla finally accepted it. Catherine then spoke to Camilla herself. She promised that she would never wear Elizabeth's possessions as weapons of comparison or as proof that one woman belonged more than another. Camilla answered with a truth she had resisted from the beginning. Comparison could not be controlled by hiding objects. Trying to prevent it had only given the brooch more power and made the wound deeper. The final moment came at their next family gathering. Catherine wore the brooch. Camilla noticed immediately, paused, then deliberately complimented it in front of Louise. The younger royal smiled. Catherine quietly touched the Queen's arm, and nobody mentioned the argument again. No apology was announced. None was needed. Louise's refusal ultimately meant something larger than defiance. It proved that continuity inside the monarchy cannot survive through possession alone. Elizabeth's legacy belongs not simply to whoever occupies the highest position, but to those trusted to carry her memory forward with restraint. Catherine kept the brooch. Louise stood by her choice. Camilla abandoned her appeal. Charles accepted the outcome. What had threatened to become a battle between present and future became something harder and more mature. An acceptance that royal generations must overlap before one eventually gives way to another. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.